Folks in. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining. My name is Patrick. I'm one of the board members here with Indivisible Illinois. We're going to get started in a few moments. We're just waiting on folks to join us from the waiting room. Thank you all for joining for this important topic. I'm going to allow some of the other board members to introduce themselves. Let's start with Marcy.
Hi, I'm Marcy. I'm from Champaign. I am also on the Indivisible Illinois Exec Board, and I'm also part of Champaign County Indivisible. How about if we go to Cecilia?
Hi, I'm Cecilia. I am with Eastern Illinois Indivisible and on the Illinois Indivisible Exec Board, and I'm with NWSOFA as well. And Linda.
Hi, I'm Linda Callis on the board and also leadership with Indivisible DuPage. Melanie.
Hi, I'm Melanie, and I'm on the Indivisible Illinois Exec Board. I also am on the leadership team with State Line Indivisible up north of Rockford and in the Rockford area. Thanks. Whoever's left.
Jeanette.
I'm Jeanette. I'm on the board. I'm forgetting who I am, but I'm in the West County suburbs and also go to the meetings for Indivisible Chicago Alliance.
All right, so thank you all for joining. We're just waiting on a few more to join us from the waiting room. I also did forget to mention that I'm also with NWSOFA. So we're going to start things off with just a few brief announcements. So I'm going to hand it over to Marcy, who's going to tell you about some of the phone banks that we have coming up. Might be on mute, Marcy.
Marcy, you're on mute.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Patrick. Yes, anyway, so yes, that we will be having phone banks starting on Sunday, August 2nd. We're going to have phone banks for every Sunday from 4 to 5:30 on Zoom and every Tuesday from 7 to 8:30 on Zoom. As we've done before, these are going to be candidate phone banks that will be like several candidates at a time. We are going to have Jen Todd for Congress in District L15, Paul Nolly for Congress in District Illinois 16, Mary Catherine Roberson for State House District Illinois 104, and Brenda Rogers for Kane County Clerk. And Brenda Rogers is one of our Indivisible group leaders for Indivisible Elgin. And you will need a computer and a phone to phone bank. And if you've never phone banked before, it's no problem because we do train. And I will put links in the chat to this coming phone bank on August 2nd and August 4th. Back to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Marcy. And we also have canvases that we're going to be doing all throughout this election cycle. In fact, we have a canvass that's going to be happening this Saturday. We hope that you all can join us. We're going to be leaving from Naperville. So if you are in the Chicagoland area and you'd like to join us, please do join us. We're going to be going from the LTDO office in Naperville. We're going to put the link into the chat. We are going to be carpooling out into the Iowa 1st Congressional District. And if you know anything about the Iowa 1st Congressional District, it's one of, if not the most contested congressional district this cycle. Last cycle, the district was lost by 0.02 percentage points. That is far less than a field margin. With all the efforts that we put into Wisconsin and other places, I wonder what would have happened had we sent canvassers into the Iowa 1st Congressional District. So please do join us. It's the fantastic candidate, Christina Bonnet is the candidate that's running out there. She has a very, very good shot at winning this race, especially with our assistance. So we're looking for as many people that can join us as possible. We're going to be meeting at 9 a.m. at the LTDO office in Lisle, or Naperville, I should say, this Saturday. So please do join us. All right, so let's get into the panel here. We have a wonderful topic that we are going to be discussing. I was inspired to put this panel on by something that I heard at one of the township meetings. One of the board and one of the township leaders mentioned, just kind of this topic, and I thought this is a great topic that I wanted to learn more about, and I wanted to know how I could support neurodiverse communities. So we are having the topic today of supporting neurodivergent communities. Just with all that we've seen, many of the attacks that we've seen at the federal level, one of the federal leaders, Stephen Miller, recently talked about just cuts to neurodiverse communities and other communities. So we want to look at ways that we can support neurodiverse communities, how we can be better allies, and how we can get people more engaged just within the community and within the political process as a whole. So we're going to hear from a wonderful group of panel members who are experts at the subject matter and those who have had lived experience with the subject matter as well. And we're going to hear from them, and we're also going to have a little bit of time for just some questions that folks may have as well. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into the panel itself. And the first question that we're going to ask the panel members is really about understanding neurodiversity. Many people want to be supportive, but aren't always sure where to begin. From your perspective, what does neurodiversity mean? What are some of the common misconceptions about neurodivergent communities? And what does meaningful allyship look like in practice? And also, we want folks to share their personal experience or those that you've worked with. So our first panel member is Sherry Haley. Sherry worked in corporate human resources for 8 years. Then her eldest son developed epilepsy and autism at the age of 2. She has since worked to increase employment opportunities for individuals with disabilities at the provider and state level before being hired in 2022 to promote best practices in employment and community inclusion with the University of Minnesota's Institute of Community Integration. Sherry also co-founded Community Access Naperville, an Illinois not-for-profit providing adults with limited communications and social skills an opportunity to be active and to engage in their community. I'm going to hand it over to Sherry.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. It is a joy to be with all of you today to talk about neurodiversity. Certainly, it is something that is very near and dear to my heart as a parent, and also as someone who has spent a good number of years, now almost 30 years, working to encourage and support inclusion and employment opportunities for people with all types of disabilities, but especially autism. When I first got into working in employment, it was mentioned to me by a state employee that people with autism are not able to work in the community. And it was such a misrepresentation and misunderstanding of people with autism and what they can bring to the community, that I'm very glad that things have changed and there is definitely more understanding of the real value that neurodivergent folks can bring to the community. So basically neurodiversity to me is just that people are individuals and have different ways of approaching issues and life, and it's just important to focus on individual strengths and areas where people can really contribute, and to understand person-centered planning and person-centered supports. And so, having worked not only with people who are able to work full-time in the community and, really thrive in all kinds of jobs, but also in supporting individuals who have very significant support needs. I think, the one statement that people make that I think is really relevant is that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. There is, such diversity and, such in terms of support needs and in terms of abilities and ability to really contribute and thrive. It's one solution does not meet the needs of all folks on the spectrum. So speaking of the spectrum, I think that's another really important thing to understand is that it is very broad. That there is quite a range of folks who are neurodivergent. Um, some things that I have found that, has been helpful in terms of the people that I have worked with is that providing clear written expectations and offering regular check-ins, offering interim deadlines. These are some of the supports that can be very helpful for people who are neurodivergent and working in, in larger workplaces, offering structure. It can be very difficult for someone who is working remotely and does not have structure to their day. Offering an opportunity to add some structure to the workplace can be very helpful for people who are neurodivergent. When you look at folks who have significant support needs, offering a predictable and personalized schedule can be very helpful. Behavior is communication. I think that's a really important thing to recognize is that if someone is exhibiting some behaviors that, can be disruptive, they're trying to tell you something. And so being very conscious of that and understanding that, there is something that, that needs to be considered, that taking a step back and, and looking at it from that perspective, I think can be really helpful. Another thing I want to point out, and then I'll let someone else give their perspective, but expressive language may or may not reflect an individual's receptive language. So the way somebody speaks or doesn't speak doesn't necessarily reflect what they understand. So really taking time to check for understanding, I think is really critical. I think for folks with higher needs, giving a single step directions and waiting for them to process that request is also really important and can be really helpful. And I will leave it there and let someone else give their perspective.
Thank you, Sherry. It's very informative. I'm going to hand it over to Melanie, who will introduce our next speaker.
Yes, we are so glad to welcome Kate Sullivan, who's a speech pathologist in the Rockford Public Schools Early Childhood Program. As both an SLP and an autistic adult, Kate brings professional and lived experiences to conversations just like these about neurodiversity, communication, and inclusion. And she's especially interested in universal design and creating environments that are more accessible and supportive for neurodivergent people. And I'm proud to have worked with Kate for a few years in the Rockford schools, and I've seen firsthand just how passionate she is at making sure everyone can just be the best they can be, right? And be successful in all sorts of situations. So we're glad to have you, Kate.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here. As Melanie said, I'm a speech language pathologist. I work primarily with preschoolers, and I am autistic. So kind of brings a different perspective to everything that I do in my work. To me, understanding neurodiversity, it really recognizes that human brains naturally vary in how we think, how we learn, how we communicate, how we process information and experience the world. And there isn't one right way for a brain to work. Um, I've spent years working with children who struggle in environments that weren't designed with them in mind. And as I've come to understand my own autism, I've realized that many of these same environmental barriers affect me as well. Um, so my autism really shapes how I see classrooms and communication and inclusion. Um, one misconception I see is that sometimes we make assumptions about what attention, communication, or even competence looks like, or is supposed to look like. For example, in school, we might assume a child isn't paying attention because they're looking away or fidgeting. But I've learned both professionally and personally that sometimes the environment is demanding so much attention, whether it's too bright, too noisy, just too much stimulation going on. It's demanding so much attention from our autistic kids that there's very little left for learning then. So looking away, moving, might actually be helping that person listen. Um, Another big one for me is that eye contact is not the same thing as attention. Um, Speaking is not the only form of communication. And behavior that can look like defiance or disinterest, it may actually be sensory overload, a need for more processing time, or just simply a different way of responding. And that's where I think meaningful allyship begins, with curiosity rather than assumptions. So instead of immediately asking, how do we get this person to behave or communicate more like everybody else? We can ask, what's getting in this person's way? What is the barrier here that we could possibly remove? And that's really changed the way that I think about how we design schools. What if we stop thinking about accommodations only as exceptions that are given to one student at a time and started thinking about many of them as just good universal design? For many autistic people, predictability makes an environment more understandable, and that really reduces anxiety and uncertainty. And it's not about rigidity. People often assume that our need for predictability is rigidity, but it's really about reducing that uncertainty. It's knowing what to expect, having choices, reducing some unnecessary sensory input, communicating clearly, having control over your environment. Um, so meaningful allyship, I don't think it requires knowing everything about autism or neurodiversity, but it means listening to neurodiverse people and believing them when they tell you what they need. Questioning our assumptions about what someone should look like or act like, and be willing to change the environment instead of just expecting the person to change. So I'll move on to the next person.
Thank you, Kate. It was very informative. All right, let's go on to our next speaker, Steve Kelser. Steve is a technology leader, a lifelong learner, and an adult who was diagnosed with autism later in life. Receiving that diagnosis gave him a new perspective on many of his life experiences and inspired him to share his story to help others better understand what autism can look like in adults through his experience. Outside of work, Steve enjoys spending time with his wife, Heather, and their pup, Penny. He loves cooking, is always in search of the perfect cold brew coffee, and enjoys learning something new every day. Steve believes that listening to different perspectives and understanding one another helps build stronger relationships, communities, and democracies. I'm going to hand it over to Steve.
And as we all say at work, somebody is talking on mute. Okay. Um, Hello, everybody. So I will say some of you know my mom, Judy Aronson, and thank you for inviting me to this. I know she's very active in your community and doing seems to be doing a great job. So get to be the proud son helping my mom tonight. So I would say that even without a diagnosis, so many of us around us are neurodivergent. It to come up with what's neurotypical is really, really difficult. And I would say that I would encourage everybody to not necessarily think of even people, I'm pretty highly functioning, even people with autism as necessarily being different, but just having a different way of thinking about the world, just like everyone next to you, if you turn to your left, turn to your right, has a different way of thinking about the world. And I don't think we need that people need a label. They need, but it's what the label has done for me though is help me kind of put some understanding towards the ways that I'm quote unquote weird. And, and that's me calling myself weird, not other, that where I'm not typical, I sit at my desk and play with my toys because and I don't know I didn't know exactly what that meant, but it a lot of people would I mean from working with people now they've told me that's a sign of autism. So I really I want to stress what Sherry said that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. I think the same thing is true for all levels of neurodivergence, and it's a scale or a spectrum for it's a spectrum for a reason, and that's important in our understanding, especially as we talk about how can we reach out to people, how can we advocate, and I think so much of that is just understanding that it's not a spectrum. And sure, there are people who, have far more trouble with their autism than I do. But there are also people like me who live a, pretty normal functioning life. Though my wife's on this call and she's kind of laughing when I say I do something normal. Um, and and the other, I guess the other thing I would say is that we really should think about different modalities of learning and not, you know, not maybe for one person they need it written down, and for other people they need a picture, and for other people they need to hear it. Um, I do really well with hearing things, and I constantly have my AirPods in my head and listening to my podcasts because that's a way that I pick up information really well. But for someone else, hearing could be something that they don't pick up from. And I think it's important that we just think about, sharing messages in multiple ways and thinking about how others are going to receive them. So, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. All right, let's go on to our next speaker, who will be introduced by Cecilia.
All right. Thanks so much, Patrick. Jessica O'Malley is a dedicated community organizer and vice chair of the Downers Grove Township Democrats, where she leads the grassroots campaign for the township's 708 Mental Health Board initiative. A 708 board assesses the local community needs and allocates taxpayer-funded resources to local agencies, helping ensure residents have access to mental health services, substance use disorder support, and developmental disability care. In addition to her advocacy work, Jessica serves as a corporate vice president and is the proud parent of an ADHD child, bringing both professional experience and lived perspective to her work advancing systemic support for neurodivergent individuals and families. Please help me in welcoming Jessica O'Malley.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel really honored to have been asked to participate. This is obviously an issue that is near and dear to all of our hearts. I always say I'm not an expert in neurodiversity, but I am an expert in my son Murphy because he is turning 11 this year, entering 5th grade. He was diagnosed with autism basically right after we started in-person school after being at home for a year and a half with COVID. That experience in itself has really shaped my activism because he was, like a difficult child. And that was like kind of the route we're taking, like with disciplinary action. And then when we started started in-person school, we were immediately put on a waiting list for a neuropsych evaluation, 6 months to a year. And we were like, what are we going to do? This is obviously an issue. He can't live in the resource room the entire school year. And luckily, my husband self-diagnosed himself with ADHD from TikTok. And it's not as long of a wait for adults to get a neuropsych evaluation. He was able to get in with a week, got his diagnosis, and then luckily hit it off with the doctor who did his evaluation. And she got my son in early. We were able to finagle the system, but not every parent has that experience. And that lag time was pivotal to us being able to connect him with the accommodations and properly address the issues he was experiencing in the educational system. And which has kind of led me to my allyship and my advocacy, which is I discovered what a 708 mental health board is and realized that Downers Grove Township was the only township in DuPage County that hadn't yet passed this. It is crucial to early intervention, which is so important for young parents. We didn't realize how much we were struggling at home with some of his ADHD or his autism traits in particular for Murphy. And I'll tell this story to this group because it's indivisible, but he always, when he has emotional dysregulation and he goes to what we call the dark place and says the worst possible thing imaginable. And when he was really little, to me, that was, I love Donald Trump. It was like the worst thing he could say to me. But it's been a really eye-opening experience. And I always think of kindness is like the most important thing you can do. You don't know what any person's experience can be, but kindness isn't enough. Breaking down the systemic challenges is like what we need to be doing to make this a world that works for everyone. I'm not an expert in neurodiversity, but I always explain it to Murphy, like your brain works differently. And this world wasn't necessarily made for the way that your brain works, but we're going to fight to make it a world that works for you. And the benefit of working in this kind of space is disability access benefits everyone. And it's, fighting for him is fighting for everyone, and fighting for everyone is fighting for him. That's it for me.
Thank you, Jessica. And I don't believe our last speaker has made it yet. I know Winfried, he's going to be at a board meeting, so he may be a little late. So we will kind of circle back through, and we'll go to the second question for everyone. And I will go ahead and ask that second question, and we'll circle back with Winfried when he arrives. So the second question that we had for everyone is, what are the most important policy priorities at the local, state, and federal levels to better support neurodivergent communities? Where should activists focus their advocacy? And what investments in education, healthcare, employment, and community services would have the greatest impact? Let's start things off again with Sherry.
Okay,
Actually,
Patrick,
Sherry, Winfried just arrived. I'm going to circle back to Winfried, and then we'll get right to you, Sherry.
Perfect.
All right, Winfried, I'm going to make you a co-host here so that you can unmute yourself. Here you are. And Winfried, I'll ask the first question again, and we can go through that. So the first question is about understanding neurodiversity. Many people want to be supportive, but aren't always sure how to begin. From your perspective, what does neurodiversity mean? What are some common misconceptions about neurodiverse communities? And what does meaningful allyship look like in practice? Share your personal experience or those of those that you work with. And I do want to give your introduction as well, Winfried. Winfried is the Regional Board of Education president. He's a trustee who was elected as the president of the Regional Board of Trustees in Kane County. Winfried was the former chair of the Elgin Human Resource Commission and creator of the Health and Healing Panel, as well as an author and activist for mental health and someone who is an adult living with autism. Winfried.
Hey, Patrick. First of all, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. First of all, the word neurodivergent, first of all, I didn't even know what that word meant. It's one of those words where I have to look it up and try to figure it out. Second, your second question is, how do I deal with it? I deal with it as the fact of that's who I am. It was hard at first as a kid, but as I got older, I treat it like it's a cell phone, and there's no joke to it. Because some phones, especially with people with autism, they transfer information or they gather information differently from others. Some phones can excel and immediately know what to put in. Once you put something in, it gets the information right away. Some buffers, some it takes longer than others. So it's nothing against being different, but the stigma of social media, the stigma of life, culture, makes that difference. Where some people have the audacity to say, oh, you have to be careful with him. He's on the spectrum. He's got this disability. You should be cautious versus, okay, he doesn't get something right away. It took him a lot longer to learn something than other people. One subject he's great at, some he struggles with. But for somebody to understand or want to understand or embrace or befriend someone with a disability, just treat us like any other person. I think the biggest mistake is when they hear someone has a disability or setback, we're treated with kid gloves. That actually causes more damage than actual good, because now it's very condescending. And then when people have conversations with people, they'll make what I call a polite insult of, oh, you speak so properly, or I didn't know that I'm impressed that you know this fact, or it's degrading. But yeah.
Thank you, Winfried. All right. We'll be back to you, Winfried, for the second question. We're going to go through the second question now. We're going to start things off with Sherry. I'm going to go ahead and read the second question again. What are the most important policy priorities at the local, state, and federal levels to better support neurodivergent communities? Where should activists focus their advocacy, and what investments in education, healthcare, employment, and community services would have the greatest impact?
Okay, I will start with my thought that hands-on training and experience is better generally than classroom experience. So if we can focus on increasing opportunities for apprenticeships, internships, work-based learning, these kinds of things, where people really get a chance to show what they're capable of in a hands-on way, it's going to be much more reflective of their ability to actually be successful on the job. I worked with an employer at one point who, as part of their interview process, they did what they called Super Week, and they invited people to come and spend a week interviewing and doing the job so that they could see whether or not the person was able to do it based on, actually getting in and doing the job. It was this was a very, it's one of the accounting firms, and so I think that was a very impressive way to get at different sort of way of interviewing. So that's my first thing. I would also say that focusing on strengths is really critical, and being flexible in terms of shifts and responsibilities. We all, in different ways, our jobs are customized for us based on where our strengths lie, and if we can do that in a more intentional way with the neurodivergent community, I think that will lead to more success. Some folks can be really fantastic in a 4-hour shift. And if you make them go to that extra hour on the shift, it all falls apart. So understanding, what works and being flexible and being able to offer that opportunity where people can actually be at their best, I think is a really positive way to think about it from an employment standpoint. From a thinking about funding for services for people who have higher support needs, community-based funding, the opportunity for people with diverse abilities to be in the community with the support that they need to be successful is really critical. So if someone needs a job coach for an extended period of time to be successful on the job, we need to have the funding to make that happen for the length of time that they need it in order to be successful. Right now, that is not the case in Illinois. It is limited in terms of that job coach support. So that's an opportunity for really focusing on the personal needs of the individual rather than a policy that is one size fits all. Housing is another really critical thing for people with high support needs, people who have high behavior needs. These folks are able to live in the community with support. It's all about providing the right level of support. Institutions need to go. It's not the best way to serve people with, with diverse needs, especially people with behavior challenges. If you personalize the services in a smaller setting, in following a personalized schedule, it's going to be much more successful. Thanks.
Thank you, Sherry. Next, we're going to go to Kate Sullivan. And if anyone needs me to repeat the question, just let me know.
I'm okay. I mean, my professional experience is primarily in early childhood and education, so I'm going to try and speak more to that. My first caveat would be that we absolutely desperately need adequate funding for special education. I mean, schools, we need special educators. We have a massive shortage of speech and language pathologists, occupational therapists, social workers, psychologists, the paraprofessionals who are working with our students. Access to AAC, which is alternative communications, and other communication supports, and enough staff and resources to actually provide the services that our students need. But I also don't think that we can fund our way out of every accessibility problem. So that gets me back to my universal design high horse. It can be a much bigger part of how we are thinking about education. Often a child struggles, we identify the problem, and then we add an individual accommodation to that child's IEP. And those individualized accommodations and services are so incredibly important. But what if we also asked, could we design this environment differently? So that fewer students are encountering that barrier in the first place. And what's encouraging, I think, is that so many of those kind of universal design practices cost little to no money, which really is important when we're facing such budget cuts and lack of funding. So just simple things like, and this is covered a little bit, but visual schedules, clear expectations, predictable routines, quieter spaces with less unnecessary background noise, less visual clutter. I don't know if you've seen a classroom lately, but there's stuff all over the walls. So much stuff on the walls. We don't need all that stuff on the walls. Giving directions verbally and visually, warnings before transitions, allowing processing time before expecting an answer or an action, providing multiple ways to communicate. And my other big one, not requiring eye contact as proof that someone is paying attention. These things are especially important for neurodivergent students, but they really can benefit all students. So I think advocacy needs to happen on both fronts. We need to adequately fund the individualized services that support our disabled and neurodivergent students, which they're entitled to, but also creating schools that are more accessible from the beginning. We shouldn't always have to be waiting for a student to struggle before we start removing barriers.
Thank you, Kate. All right. Next, let's go to Steve. Steve Kelser. Steve, you might be on mute.
I did it again. Okay. So from my perspective, it all goes back to education, and education starting, whether that's universal kindergarten, pre-K, going down as early as we can get kids into school, and making sure that the right tools and the right learning is there for each of them. And I am a huge proponent of, funding our public schools, not only for neurodivergent students, but for everyone. As I said, so many of us have neurodivergence and will never have a diagnosis, don't necessarily need a diagnosis, but need the support of different modalities of learning. And I think that another big part of that is through funding and through normalization of different learning techniques, we can remove the stigma of special education. And that, when I was growing up, I grew up in Los Angeles, and if you were in special ed, there was a definite stigma around being in special ed. I know some of the kids who were in special ed, and a good friend of mine did 6 months with it, and then his parents put him back into the regular program because he wasn't learning anything. And it was not a good place. It was not a good place to be. Were there systems that could have helped me? Yeah, absolutely. But I was better off, from my perspective, at least looking back at it, I was better off having not been in special education, because it was not the place you went to go be successful. It was the place they put kids that they didn't know what to do with. And I'm sorry if that's too blunt, but that was my lived experience. And I think that it's going to take a lot of funding and a lot of retraining, and certainly education for our politicians, to be able to see a new perspective and a new way of doing things.
Thank you, Steve. All right. Next, let's go to Jessica O'Malley.
I have like chills listening to everyone because I just agree so much, and so much of it just rings so true. I give the same advice to everyone who's asking for advice on like how to get involved, how to become an activist. It's really hard, especially when there's like such a bombardment of things happening. You want to do everything. You care about all these things so passionately. It's like pick a thing if you can, and like really like put yourself into it fully. Sometimes if you spread yourself out, it's really hard to give things adequate attention. You also suffer from burnout. So that's always my advice to anybody looking to get involved. The nice thing about like most issues, including being an advocate for the neurodiverse community, is like everything is intersectional. So like if you're really passionate about LGBTQ rights, neurodivergent people are like, I think it's like 3 to 6 times more likely to identify as LGBTQ. There's lots of interconnectedness in the things that are happening, like housing and human rights in general. I always think about the core disability advocacy principle, which is nothing about us without us. And I really hold that true. My son is 10, and I let him tell me, we have discussions, but like he knows what's best for himself. And, coming up as watching him get older, like it was really important for his dad and I to talk to him and involve him in his own journey. He knows himself best. We're, guiding him. But it's been really important. He's in a special education environment. He goes to a full-time therapeutic school. And even in that setting, we really have to advocate for him, but like help him learn how to advocate for himself. I think that's really important. The thing that I go full in it on this year is the passing the 708 mental health board in Downers Grove Township. I would recommend all of you, if you live in Illinois, look to see if your township has a 708 mental health board. If it doesn't, make that be your thing, because it is an excellent resource because it is super localized. It's your community tax dollars going to fund organizations and groups doing the work in your community. So it's really flexible towards the need. So if you have like a shortfall of early intervention programs, or you have a shortfall of programs that are supporting people as they're aging out of the system in their early 20s with housing and jobs, it can really fill in some of those gaps. I'm looking really at a funding perspective. When we were out collecting signatures, people would oftentimes be like, well, doesn't DuPage County already have like a mental health thing? There's never enough money. And the nice thing about the 708 is it's super localized. So it's really responsive to your community needs.
Thank you, Jessica. All right, gonna turn it over to Winfried.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure, absolutely. The question is, what are the most important policy priorities at the local, state, and federal level to better support neurodivergent communities? Where should activists focus their advocacy, and what investments in education, healthcare, employment, and community services would have the greatest impact?
Honestly, I think funding is the biggest priority. That's first off. Second, with that funding, do more training. Understand concepts. Work with law enforcement on how to coach. Activists. Look for any community organization that has mental health and ask them to sponsor an event. Very quickly, tomorrow, we're going to have an event called Health and Healing, where we're going to have in the Elgin area mental health boards. Panelists. First, it's going to be a panelist conversation about mental health, general questions, community conversation questions, workshops. But also, we're going to have mental health organizations or dealing with mental health all under one roof. There's no tax money spent on this, because most cities, if you have an agreement with like a certain, say a ballroom or any type of area, they waive fees. There's no cost to it. Second, with activists, when you have the passion of doing something, understand, unless there's a crisis, unfortunately, you're not going to get a lot of support. I hate saying it. I'm sorry if that sounds offensive, but I've reached out to multiple media outlets about mental health, about what we're doing. No one called me back. This is not about raising my profile. This is going to be this is our first summer event and our third mental health event. No one reached out back to us. But I promise you, if something went wrong or some tragedy happens, the same outlets that ignored us will blame mental health. Oh, he had this disability. He was responsible for this. He wasn't taking. What I'm saying is there's going to be a lot of criticism, but very little support. So you're going to have to find a lot of like-minded people to help you.
Thank you, Winfried. And the event tomorrow, is it going to be on Symphony Way?
Yes, it's at the Ecker Center. I sent you a flyer, I thought, but I can retext it to you.
Thank you. And I'm going to put a link. I've got the Facebook here. I'm going to put that in the chat just for anyone that's in the Elgin Kane County area so that they know where the event is. It's in the chat there for everyone. All right. Thank you, Winfried. All right, we're going to go on to question number 3, and we're going to start with you, Winfried. We're going to do the reverse order for this one. And this question is on being more inclusive. A healthy democracy depends on everyone having the opportunity to participate. What barriers do neurodivergent individuals face in civic life? And what can organizations like Indivisible Illinois, elected officials, and everyday activists do to create a more inclusive community that ensures that every voice is heard? And I know the event that you're doing tomorrow is a big part of that. So Winfried, I'm going to start with you with this question.
So it's pretty much know your audience. What you want to do is, and this is something I'm learning. I work in the sheriff's office. I love my job. I've been there for 6 years. I have a wonderful boss. I have great supervisors. And it's not just a BS, oh, I love my supervisor. I actually have healthy supervisors saying, look, if I mess up, explain what happened so we can fix it. I had a situation today. No yelling, no swearing at me. Just ask me why was something happen. Because they treat me like a normal person. They don't care that I have a disability. They do care if I'm struggling, but they don't care, oh, treat me a kid gloves. They're like, look, we want you on this team. We want you to be successful, but we're being successful. You're going to have to take criticism. So if I'm just goofing off on YouTube for like 2 hours, I'm going to get chewed out. But empathy is a big factor. Respect is the biggest thing, I think. I don't like how some people, or even elected, non-elected, some people will take pictures saying, I'm a big supporter. This is my friend. He's got this disability versus, hey, this is a guy I've known for years. We go back and forth about stuff. Which one do you think is more appropriate? Because a lot of them will like the clout. They would like to say, hey, look, I'm friends with people with all types of disabilities. I hate that personally. And I apologize if I sound like I'm ranting because there's so much, and to me, I feel like it's insulting. A lot of people will use mental health for their gain leverage, but when it comes to treating someone like, hey, let's go grab food, hey, let's do this, you never hear from them. Honestly, I feel like people with disabilities are treated like a third-class citizen. When they need votes or funding or to make a point, then we're noticed. But when we're struggling, oh, we just got to toughen it out or we get ignored. And what people don't understand is the environment people treat those with mental illness or struggling with a mental disability leads to other problems. So if a kid that's bullied for being autistic or dyslexic, what happens? They're going to rash out. They're going to start, they could go into gangs, they could go into addiction because they're trying to find a way to cope. And unfortunately, some kids cope with the unhealthiest ways. So that's just my piece.
Thank you, Winfried. All right, let's go to Jessica.
Wasn't on the unmute button. So just thinking about accessibility, especially as it relates to democracy, I'm sure you've heard this before, but like the accommodations that COVID provided as far as hybrid options, flexible schedule, formatting, like we should be fighting to continue those because they've opened up a lot of doors for people. Public meetings are hard for some people, like big groups of people, public speaking, putting weight on especially like I think about the importance of public comment. Like it's a really crucial part of democracy. It is not for everyone. People don't like to speak in front of groups. They can't come to a big meeting. You shouldn't have more weight to a public comment than the ability to email a comment. They should still be equal. So making sure that those options and those alternatives are available. having meetings at like accessible hours, being flexible with some of the rigid rules. Those are also really limiting, especially for someone who has some rigidity. And like there's certain, like I'll speak from my experience with my son, he gets embarrassed. Like if he gets in trouble and does something wrong, he gets really embarrassed and that causes him to dysregulate. And just having those kind of accommodations and flexibility can make a big difference, go a long way. And then the same with like information, making sure that information is accessible and relatable to people and not like a barrier to understand a process or the ability to participate.
Thank you, Jessica. Let's go next to Steve.
All right. So the first thing that comes to my mind when I hear this question is that there's not necessarily one thing we need to do for neurodivergent adults. We don't, but hearing some of the things that have been said, especially the around public comment and supporting email versus physically going to the meeting and talking in front of people. I think that's great. We should support really any way that people want to communicate. I think that even small things like having a diagram of how to fill out a ballot versus just saying, so fill in a circle with a blue pen. Actually, I think it has to be black. But fill in the circle, fill in the circle with the pen. I think it's important to make sure that we also show that diagram, and that we open as many avenues to as many people as possible, to encourage as many people as possible to get involved with democracy. And I think, echoing what Kate said, universal design is critical. People when they first did the curb cuts so that people in a wheelchair could go down them, there was a lot of thought about how expensive it would be versus how usable it would be for others. And if I haven't had children, but I know from my friend, anybody who has children knows that those curb cuts are great for strollers. And that one concept of universal design, made everything easier for a lot of people instead of just for people who had a specific disability.
Thank you, Steve. Right. Next, let's go to Kate.
Okay. Well, I think if we want neurodivergent people to participate in civic life, we need to make civic participation more accessible for neurodivergent people. So I'm going to give a quick example. The questions were sent to us ahead of time, and that, like, for me, was very, very helpful. Knowing what I'm going to be asked, it gives me time to process the questions, to organize my thoughts. I wrote it all down just to kind of guide me on what I wanted to say. And so that's very helpful to me as an autistic person, but I assume for the non-autistic people on the panel, that was probably pretty helpful too. So some things, organizations can provide agendas ahead of meetings, clearly explain what to expect, offer information both verbally and in writing, multiple ways to participate. Like Steve was saying, not everybody wants to get up to a microphone and speak. So what other things can we do so that our voices can be heard? Allowing people to submit written comments or written questions. And then just in general, providing quieter areas at large events, websites and registration processes that can be clearer and easier to navigate. And then event information, and this is a really big one, and I've taken a survey of other autistic people I know, like, where do you park? Where do you go in? Where are the bathrooms? How long will it last? What did you expect when you arrive? Like, those are all, like, really take some anxiety off of going to different kinds of civic events and things like that. They reduce that uncertainty. They make participation easier. And we do, again, as Steve was saying, we embrace this idea of universal design in every light, like he was saying with the curb cutouts or automatic doors, closed captioning. I mean, I use closed captioning. So they were there for one group of people to make their life easier, but it's made everybody's life easier. And I think that we can approach neurodiversity in the exact same way, and instead of asking us to continually adapt to systems that weren't designed for us in mind, that we can ask how those systems can be designed differently so that more people can participate in the first place.
Thank you, Kate. All right, let's now go to Sherry.
Okay, so my first recommendation is mail-in voting is so important for people with disabilities, just in general, to have that as an option so you can take your time, go through it and do it at your own pace rather than having to, stand at the, at the booth. So, and then even bigger than that is, I have a lot of concern about, as many of you do, I'm sure, regarding HR1, or the big beautiful bill, and the impact that can potentially have on Medicaid funding. They need to find $1 trillion in Medicaid funding, and community living, or what's called home and community-based services, is optional, versus institutional living is required. And so all of the work that advocates have done over the years to increase inclusion and increase the ability of folks with disabilities to live with supports in their communities is at risk. And so just, being aware of that and being alert to the signs. They are already putting out information about, how the Olmstead Act is, maybe there's some wiggle room there. And so I think we need to be just really paying attention to those kinds of things.
Thank you, Sherry. All right, we're going to kind of transition into a few questions that have been placed into the chat. But before we get to those questions, I do want to go back through a few brief announcements again. I'm going to hand it over to Marcy to start with the announcements.
Okay, yes. So thank you, Patrick. I just want to mention that our phone banks will be starting again this Sunday, every Sunday from 4 to 5:30 p.m. and every Tuesday from 6 to 7:30 p.m. We will be phone banking on Zoom. We will initially be doing it for 4 candidates. For Jennifer Todd for Congress, District Illinois 15, Paul Nally for Congress, District Illinois 16, Mary Catherine Roberson for State House, District Illinois 104, and Brenda Rogers, one of our own Indivisible leaders for Kane County Clerk. And I will put links in the chat again to the 2 first phone banks, the one on Sunday 8/2 from 4 to 5:30 p.m. on Zoom, and this is all Central Time, by the way. And then the one Tuesday from 7 to 8:30 p.m. on Zoom.
Right, and we also are going to be doing canvassing. So we've got our road to November where we're going to do canvassing across Illinois and to our battleground states. So we're going to be going out to Kane County and canvassing for Brenda Rogers and other candidates out in the Kane County area. We're going into the 16th Congressional District and canvassing for Paul Nally, who's running for Congress. But we're also going to the battleground states. And this Saturday, we are going to one of the highest contested congressional races in the country, which is the Iowa 1st Congressional District. We're going to be leaving from the LTDO office in Naperville at 9 a.m. We're going to be carpooling. It's about 2 hours to Davenport, Iowa. So please do join us if you can, or from anywhere in the state if you want to meet us in Davenport at noon. This is a race that last time was lost by 0.2 percentage points. So it's a race that we can win this cycle just with a little bit of support going out into the Davenport area. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to go through the questions. I saw a lot of fantastic questions for our amazing panelists in the chat. So I'm going to hand it over now. I believe that Jeanette was going to be taking care of the questions.
Okay, we've got a few, and I may ask for help, but starting with, first of all, we definitely would like for the universal, for Kate, to put the list of universal design ideas or whatever information you can put in the chat on universal.
I put it in the chat somewhere.
Okay. Yeah, you had some stuff in there. Okay, good. So if you want to repost it, or one of us can do that.
I can do it again. I'll do it one more time.
Yeah, thank you. Another question for Ed, or really anyone, I think, how do you introduce to a child that they are neurodivergent, or do they discover it on their own? And what impact can this have on their self-image? Let me know if you want me to repeat it. Did Ed hear that? Anyone?
Was that question just for anyone, or?
Well, it said for Ed, but I think, for anyone.
I think Ed might be.
I think it was from Ed.
It was from Ed.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, I think it's for anyone then. How do you introduce a child that they are neurodivergent, or do they discover it on their own? And what impact can this have on their self-image?
Looks like Winfried.
I would let the child learn it on their own. Let them follow their path with it. And after being tested, talk to a doctor, have that one-on-one conversation with them. And let them let them find out on their own, but also be there to be like that support system at the same time. Because a family member of mine, well, through marriage, she had bipolar disorder. And I noticed her frustration with certain words, certain attitudes. And we've bonded over, okay, are you mad because of this? Is this what are you afraid of? It's like those questions of what I would go through, I would try to compare with her. And she felt much safer talking to me. And there was an incident with school where she's not taking her meds. She was afraid. I said, look, I get it, but this is for your health. Because you're valuable, you're loved, and I get it. You struggle, we're going to struggle with this together. It's that communication. But if you let you tell a kid something, especially young, they're going to think it and they're going to copy that behavior. I'd rather them just find out on their own and just guide them.
Would anyone else like to comment on the question of working with children and how to deal with that process?
I think knowing is very freeing and helps you understand yourself and learn to advocate better for yourself. So it kind of depends on the age of the child and how much information that you're introducing at any given time. But I have noticed, many kids just think that they are fatally flawed, and finding out, no, your brain just works differently is very freeing and encourages, like I said, that self-advocacy piece, understanding what it is that they need, how their brain works, etc.
Thank you, Kate. And Winfried, thank you too. I moved down a little too quickly there. Thank you to all of you for answering. Anyone else like to touch on that, or we will go to
Sorry, I'll add one thing. Just speaking from my own lived experience, when I was in college, I was taking Hebrew, and my professor came up to me and she goes, "You can't spell in Hebrew, you can't spell in English. I can't help you if you don't get a note from a doctor, and I want you to go get tested." And I got tested and was found to have dysgraphia, and a- it was such like a wonderful experience because it was like, oh, there's something different, and the guy who did the testing gave me all these tools and said, here are ways that you can, here are ways that you can do better. And I went from about a 2.6 to a 3.1 by being able to have those tools. And so I have no experience of raising my own children. I did teach for a long time and and have some experience that way. So I can't say when it's appropriate to tell a child and how young or any of those things. But I would think that it's empowering when a child is ready, whether that's age-wise or emotionally ready, to be able to say, you do this a little different than others, and here are the tools, here are how we're going to help you to thrive.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. I think a related question that's come up in the chat in a few different ways is about getting diagnosed later in life. Some people have had that experience. Another person wondered how they would get tested. Does anyone have something to offer on later in life diagnoses?
So, as I said when they introduced me, I was diagnosed at 40, and it was very hard to find somebody who did the diagnosis for adults, but also took my insurance was another big thing for me because we found lots of places that would gladly take $3,000 to $6,000 from us to do the diagnosis, and that was just not not a way we wanted to go. And through a lot of research, actually primarily done by my wife, we found a doctor who was or a neuro sure neuro she was neuropsychiatrist, I believe, who did the testing. Now, unfortunately, once they did the testing, I said, "So what do I do now? Who do I go see?" And she goes, "Oh, I don't know. I only work with children." So that was not the most helpful part of that experience, but there are people who do the testing and hopefully some that take your insurance.
Excellent point. Thank you. Let's see what else we have. Another specific question came up about earlier for Jessica. Are they using DBT? I think that's dialectic behavior therapy in his school or classroom. Is anyone able to talk about DBT being used for students with autism diagnoses or similar?
Googling it, so I might not be the best person to answer that question.
Okay. Could be. I know where I have been working in LaGrange at the Department of Special Education that we have social workers that train in that and do that, and it can be it's known as a very valid clinical approach, and definitely uses verbal skills, but is very client-centered and very specific to that person. And that's probably one reason why it can really be helpful. We've got, thank you, Kate, all the universal design ideas. If anyone wants to copy that information down real quick, you can just cut and paste from the chat, stick it somewhere on your laptop or in your notes. Way in the beginning, Sherry mentioned expressive language not matching comprehension. You want to explain that a little bit more? Expressive language, not being necessarily a good representation of what a a person, a worker, a learner understands.
Sure. There sometimes can be a mismatch there where in some cases you have individuals who have no speech at all, so no expressive language, but they understand everything that is being communicated to them. And so there are some times where there are assumptions made that are not real. And so it's important not to make that assumption that either someone who is very verbal maybe doesn't have that comprehension and understanding of what they're saying. And it can also be someone who has no verbal speech but understands everything. So just important to not make those assumptions based on one or the other.
Sure. And I would just follow up with that. Like one of the things that, we work really hard on in the schools is to presume competence.
Mm-hmm.
Kate,
Yeah.
will you share
Especially for our non-speaking friends, because they, just because they can't necessarily communicate their understanding doesn't mean that they don't have the understanding.
Kate, will you expand on what presumed competence means if people aren't familiar with that phrase?
Oh, sure. Like, for example, I have a lot of kids who use like little talkers to communicate. And I get them when they're really young. And so, and we just want to presume that they are competent and are going to be able to utilize this technology, that they're understanding what is being said to them, and that they're going to be able to, like I said, utilize this technology.
Thank you for clarifying that. Let's see what we have left. One thing that was mentioned in the chat is an association, CASA, advocates usually for kids in foster care. So that information was in the chat. Crystal asked the question. Or I think Crystal, you mentioned CASA. Can you tell us what CASA stands for? CASA, an Autism Association, maybe? Not sure. We can look it up. Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you. I think that might cover everything that was, well, way at the beginning from Mark, made the comment, do you think perhaps we're all in some kind of spectrum? So if anyone wants to take on a big picture question, do you think we're all on some kind of spectrum? That came early as we started getting into the discussion. I would say yes.
I'll echo that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, that to define neurotypical is a kind of confusing thing versus saying that people are on a spectrum of the way they understand, the way they communicate, the way they associate with others. And I think that if we understand the world more as a spectrum, it's a lot easier to figure out where we're gonna find common ground with people rather than just saying they're different, they're not neurotypical, and kind of pushing them to the side.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. That's a good point. And I think somebody early also in the chat talked about neurodivergent people, if you're using that term, aren't necessarily disabled, but some may apply and receive disability benefits. And I think that's another important part of spectrum is that, for anyone who's lived with or known or worked with people with that diagnosis, those kinds of diagnoses, you see these things can happen in all different amounts and affect, have some people may have a lot of symptoms and some don't. So I think, you often see in many areas, public spaces of people who might identify as neurodivergent, but don't have a disability, don't receive accommodations and so on. So I think it's kind of getting more sensitive to things like universal design. They kind of help with that. Okay, Patrick, I'm going to turn it over to you. Susan has her hand raised, and let's see if we want to finish up with some of that.
Sure, absolutely. Susan, I'm going to go ahead and if you had something that you wanted to add, let's see, Susan. Oh, Susan put Susan's hand down, so maybe Susan doesn't have anything to add, but I did want to thank all of our amazing panel members for being here today. I wanted to thank Sherry, thank Kate, thank Steve, thank Jessica, and thank Winfried for really informing us. This panel has been very, very informative. I do want to give a shout out to Robert, who really was the inspiration for us putting together this panel. Robert, brought up this topic at one of our township meetings, and I did hear what he said, and I thought it was a very important topic that we needed to understand more about, and just folks that we know in the community. We made sure to get them here on the panel here tonight. So, just thank you to all of our panel members. I do want to go through the panel members. If there's anything that any of you would like to add in closing, please feel free to add anything in closing, whether it's Sherry, Steve, Kate, Jessica, or Winfried. Is there anything else that you would like to add in closing?
I'll just say thank you for the opportunity to be part of this tonight. It was a pleasure to be with all of you and to have the opportunity to have the conversation.
Thank you, Sherry. Winfried.
Thanks for inviting me to this panel. This has been very helpful. When it comes to have with children, especially if they have a disability, once that is established, the biggest, most important thing is tell them not to open up about it. For the simple fact is, at a certain point in age, they have to first embrace it. They have to accept it. They have to acknowledge it. They have to be okay with it. Because the thing is, when kids that are in special ed or special needs, they're going to be bullied, unfortunately. A lot of them have bullied. A lot of them is going to be used for other kids. So just teach them like any other children, right from wrong. Just support them, but let them make their own mistakes. But if there's mistakes that can be prevented, talk to them. And if you treat your kids differently for having a disability, you're making things worse. It's okay to have limitations, but do not limit them from being their full potential.
Winfried, to me, that's sort of like universal design for working with kids and people of all kinds, right? Paying attention to the individual as well as being aware of everything going on around and then working from there. Good points. Thank you.
Would any of the other panelists like to add anything in closing?
Thanks for having us talk about this tonight. This is very important, and I hope that we can, just create communities that are more understandable and more flexible and more welcoming for everybody.
Absolutely. All right. Would anyone else like to? If not, I do want to thank you all for joining the panel and thank you all for being here today. We're working to build more inclusive communities, especially in our groups that we volunteer with, whether they're indivisible groups within our civic organizations and within the community. This is a part of how we build those inclusive communities and make sure that everyone is included. So I want to thank you all for being here today. This is recorded, so you can watch it on YouTube. It's on our YouTube site. It will also be on our website. We're going to post the URL for our YouTube page into the chat. So if anyone would like to share it with anyone, or if anyone would like to watch the recording later on, you are able to do that. We'll also email it out to everyone so that you can watch the recording as well. Thank you all for being here today, and we will see you on the next panel or with one of our volunteer events, hopefully on Saturday for the campus or on Sunday for a phone bank.